The zip tie bit into Colonel Reginald Okafor's wrists before he could finish saying his own name. That detail matters. Not the cold concrete floor of the parking garage. Not the flashlight aimed directly into his eyes. Not even the 2 security guards who had knocked his phone from his hand and sent it skidding across the oil-stained pavement. What mattered was the zip tie, the decision to restrain a man in a tailored charcoal suit, carrying nothing but a leather briefcase, because in that moment it told Reginald Okafor everything he needed to know about who these men thought they were looking at. They were wrong, catastrophically wrong, and by the time the sun went down over Charlotte, North Carolina, they would understand exactly how wrong. It was a Thursday in early October, the kind of day that couldn't decide between summer and fall. The air outside the Meridian Grand Hotel carried a bite that hadn't been there a week ago, and the trees lining Trade Street had just begun to turn at the edges, gold bleeding into green. Reginald Okafor had driven up from Fort Bragg that morning, a 2.5-hour drive he had made in his personal vehicle, a silver 2021 Audi A8 that his daughter had helped him pick out the previous Christmas, a year before she deployed to Okinawa. He was not in uniform. He was technically on leave, attending a 2-day leadership symposium hosted by the Veterans Policy Alliance at the Meridian Ground. He had been invited as a keynote speaker for the following morning's session. The subject of his address: the institutional failures that allow systemic bias to persist inside bureaucratic structures long after the laws designed to eliminate them are passed. He had no idea he would be living a case study before dinner. Colonel Okafor was 51 years old. He stood 6 feet even, with the kind of posture that didn't come from vanity, but from 30 years of muscle memory. His head was shaved close, his face angular, the skin at his temples carrying a few lines that his wife called dignity and his son called distinguished. He moved quietly through the world, the way men who have operated in genuinely dangerous places tend to do, economically, deliberately, without wasted motion. He had parked in the hotel's attached garage at approximately 4:47 in the afternoon. He had his reservation confirmation on his phone, his government travel card in his wallet, and a name badge from the symposium still hanging around his neck from the afternoon's registration session. The garage was dim. That was the first thing. The fluorescent panels on level 2 had at least 2 bulbs out, leaving stretches of grey shadow between the parked cars. Reginald noted it the way he noted everything. Quietly, filed away. He was walking toward the elevator bank when he heard footsteps behind him accelerate. "Sir." "Hey, stop right there." He stopped. He turned slowly, hands visible at his sides. 2 men in white security polo shirts were moving toward him with the energy of people who had already decided what they were about to do. The one in front was younger, maybe 26, with a jaw that jutted forward like a challenge. The one behind was older, heavy-set, breathing through his mouth. The younger one had his hand on a radio like it was a sidearm. "Can I help you?" Reginald said. His voice was even. "We need to see your parking pass," the younger one said. His name tag read, T. Bjornet. "And your room key." "I'm a guest at the hotel," Reginald said. He reached slowly into his jacket pocket and produced the confirmation printout. "I'm checking in today. The symposium registration is around my neck." Burnett glanced at the badge. His expression didn't change. "Where's your room key?" "I don't have one yet. I haven't checked in, I just arrived. I came to the garage first because—" "How'd you get into the garage without a key card?" Burnett interrupted. "The gate was open. The arm was up when I drove in." The older guard, his tag read D. Sowell, had circled slightly to Reginald's left. The positioning was deliberate. They were flanking. Reginald had taught infantry officers to do exactly that when approaching a potential threat. He recognized the geometry. "What's in the briefcase?" Sowell asked. "Documents, notes for a presentation." Reginald kept his voice steady. "I'm a speaker at the Veterans Policy Alliance Symposium. There's a lanyard around my neck with my name and affiliation." Burnett leaned in, squinting at the badge. "Says Colonel. That's some kind of title?" "It's a military rank, United States Army." "You got ID for that?" "I have a driver's license, a government travel card, and a Department of Defense identification in my wallet. If you'd like me to retrieve them, I will do so slowly and on the rate what I'm doing." Something shifted in Burnett's expression, not toward reason, but toward irritation. Like Reginald's calmness was itself suspicious. Like a man explaining himself clearly was performing something. "Sir, we've had reports of vehicles being broken into on this level," Burnett said. "You match a description." The phrase landed like a stone dropped in still water. Reginald let the ripple spread before he answered. "What is the description?" Burnett didn't answer that. "I'd like to call the hotel manager," Reginald said. "We'll handle this," Sowell said. "I'm sure you will," Reginald said. "I'd still like to call the hotel manager." What happened next took less than 4 seconds. Burnett stepped forward. His hand closed around Reginald's left arm just above the elbow. Sowell moved from the left. There was a brief, hard struggle. Reginald did not resist, but his body stiffened reflexively, the way any human body does when seized without warning. And then the plastic zip tie appeared from somewhere on Sowell's belt and clicked into place around both wrists. Reginald Okafor stood in the parking garage of the Meridian Grand Hotel with his hands bound in front of him and looked at the 2 men who had put them there. "I need you to understand something," he said. His voice had gone very quiet. "You are going to want to have made a different choice in approximately 20 minutes. "Stop talking," Burnett said. "I'm not threatening you," Reginald continued. "I'm informing you. There is a difference. I've spent 30 years teaching that difference to people with considerably more capability than either of you." Sowell grabbed his arm and steered him toward the stairwell door. They put him in the hotel's security office, a windowless room behind the front desk that smelled of burnt coffee and the particular staleness of recycled air that never quite turns over. A metal chair, a folding table, a camera in the upper corner of the ceiling that Reginald noted immediately. They left him there. He sat with his hands in his lap and closed his eyes for exactly 3 breaths. He was not meditating. He was calculating. His phone was on the garage floor. His wallet was in his jacket, still on his person. They hadn't taken it. The zip tie was tight, but he wasn't going anywhere. He'd learned a long time ago that the most dangerous thing a detained person could do was move in ways that gave frightened people an excuse. He was not going to give them an excuse. He was going to be very, very still. And he was going to let the machine he had served for 30 years do what it was built to do. The door opened after 9 minutes. Not Burnett. Not Sowell. A woman in a different uniform. Hotel staff, blazer, the Meridian Grand logo on her lapel. She was perhaps 40, with close-cropped natural hair and an expression that moved through several emotions in rapid succession when she looked at Reginald. Confusion, discomfort, something that might have been recognition when she saw the symposium badge still hanging around his neck. "Sir," she said. Her name tag read, Lorraine Fields, Guasafas, Managa. "I apologize for the wait. Can you tell me?" She stopped. She looked at his wrists. Did they zip tie you?" "They did," Reginald said. Lorraine Fields closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, she looked like a woman doing rapid arithmetic in her head, and none of the numbers were adding up to anything good. "Sir, your name?" "Colonel Reginald Okafor. I'm a registered speaker at the Veterans Policy Alliance Symposium. My confirmation number is on that printout." He nodded toward the table where Burnett had dropped it. "And I believe my name appears in the event program that is currently available at the registration desk, approximately 40 feet from where we're sitting." Lorraine picked up the printout. She looked at it for a long moment. She set it down and walked out without another word, leaving the door slightly ajar. Reginald could hear elevated conversation in the hallway. He couldn't make out the words. He heard a phone ring and be answered. He heard footsteps, more than 2 sets, moving with purpose. He waited. The door opened again, and this time it was not Lorraine Fields. It was a man in a full suit, the kind of suit that means management, not staff. His face was flushed and his tie was slightly crooked, as if he'd straightened it in a hurry. "David Kessler, General Managa," said the badge. Behind him was Lorraine Fields. Behind her was T. Burnett, who now looked like a man who had recently understood something terrible. Kessler stared at the zip tie on Reginald's wrists. His face moved through the same sequence Lorraine's had, but faster and with considerably more alarm at the end. "Colonel Okafor," Kessler said. His voice was controlled, but there was a tremor underneath it. "I am the general manager of this property. I want to first apologize." "Mr. Kessler," Reginald said. "The zip tie." Kessler turned to Burnett. "Get that off him, now." Burnett produced a small folding knife and cut the plastic. The relief of circulation returning was sharp. Reginald rubbed his wrists with 2 fingers each and said nothing. "I want to assure you this was a misunderstanding," Kessler began. "I'm aware that's what you want," Reginald said. "I'd like my phone, please. It was knocked from my hand in the garage, level 2, near the elevator bank, approximately bay 14. Kessler looked at Sowell, who was now hovering in the doorway. "Get it." Sowell disappeared. "Colonel, we can absolutely resolve this internally," Kessler said, with the particular energy of a man calculating liability in real time. "I'd like to speak with you privately. We can offer." "I'm going to make 2 phone calls," Reginald said. He stood. He was unhurried. He adjusted his jacket. "And then I'm going to check in for my room. My keynote is tomorrow morning at 9. I would suggest you use the time between now and then to locate every piece of footage from this garage and this office, and to ensure that it is preserved." Kessler blinked. "Are you?" "I'm informing you," Reginald said, with the same tone he'd used in the garage. "Not threatening. The difference still applies." Sowell returned with the phone. The screen was cracked in one corner from the fall, a thin diagonal fracture through the lower left. Reginald looked at it for one moment, slid it into his pocket, and walked out. He made the first call in the elevator. The second call he made from a chair in the hotel lobby, in plain view of the front desk, with his back straight and his voice at the volume he used in a conference room full of senior officers, not raised but carrying. The first call was to his attorney, a man named Calvin who had been 1 year behind him at West Point and who now ran a civil rights practice in Washington that had, in the past decade, won judgments totaling more than $30 million against municipalities, corporations, and government contractors. Calvin picked up on the second ring. "It's Reggie," Okafor said. "I need you to open a file." He relayed the events in precise sequential order, the way he'd been trained to report: time, location, actors, actions, outcomes. He did not editorialize. He did not raise his voice. He gave Calvin the name of the hotel, the names on the security guards' badges, the name of the general manager, and the confirmation that physical force had been used and restraints applied. Calvin, to his credit, said very little while Reginald spoke. When the account was finished, there was a brief silence. "Are you injured?" "Bruising on both wrists. Nothing broken." "Are you still on property?" "I'm in the lobby." "Don't leave. Don't check out. Don't accept any offers of compensation or written statements from the hotel. I'm calling their corporate counsel in about 4 minutes. You'll hear from me within the hour." The second call was to Brigadier General Cynthia Tate, the Commanding General of the Installation Management Command's Southeast Region, who was also the chairwoman of the Veterans Policy Alliance Symposium that Reginald was scheduled to address in approximately 16 hours. Cynthia Tate answered on the third ring and said, "Reggie, are you still in the garage? I was expecting you at the reception at 5. "I'm in the lobby," he said. "I've been delayed." "I need to tell you something," he told her. The silence on the other end of that call was the kind that happens when someone is very deliberately not saying the first thing that comes to mind. "They zip-tied you," she said finally. "They did. In the parking garage of the venue where you are speaking tomorrow morning." "Correct." "Reggie." "Yes. I'm calling the executive director of the Alliance, and I'm calling the mayor's office. Charlotte has been in active dialogue with the Army about the economic impact of Fort Bragg on this region for 18 months. The mayor's office will want to know about this." "I appreciate that, Cynthia." "Don't thank me. I'm angry." "I know," Reginald said. "So am I. I'm just quieter about it." He ended the call and sat in the lobby and waited. It took 47 minutes. The first indicator was the arrival of a woman in a sharp grey blazer and dark slacks, who entered through the main doors, spoke briefly with the front desk, looked around the lobby, and when her eyes found Reginald, sitting alone, suit jacket still on, briefcase at his feet, posture like he was chairing a meeting, walked directly toward him. She had the bearing of someone who dealt with problems for a living and had stopped being surprised by them. Her name was Meredith Boone. She was the Southeast Regional Director of Guest Relations for the Meridian Grand's parent company, a hospitality group with 37 properties across the United States. She had driven from her office in uptown Charlotte. The drive had taken 11 minutes. Reginald knew, because Cynthia Tater called back 9 minutes after their first conversation to inform him that the parent company's executive team had been notified by the Alliance's executive director, whose board included 2 former secretaries of defense and a sitting United States senator from North Carolina. The senator's office had also been notified. The senator happened to be on the Armed Services Committee. Meredith Boone sat down across from Reginald without being invited to, which he respected. People who asked permission to sit when they had something difficult to say were usually stalling. "Colonel Okafor," she said, "I've been briefed on what occurred today. I want to begin by telling you that what happened was wrong. It was indefensible, and there is no version of this conversation where I or anyone at this company attempts to minimize it." Reginald looked at her. "All right. I also want you to know that the 2 individuals involved have been removed from their posts for the remainder of their shift, and a formal internal investigation has been opened as of approximately 20 minutes ago." She paused. "I understand your attorney is already in contact with our corporate counsel." "He is. And that the mayor's office has been in contact with our ownership group. I wouldn't know the details of that." Meredith Boone had very steady eyes. "Colonel, I'm not here to negotiate. I'm here to listen and to tell you that this company is going to do what's right. I mean that without any asterisks attached." Reginald looked at her for a long moment. He had spent 30 years reading people across tables in situations where reading them incorrectly had consequences. He believed her, not because she was polished, or because she had arrived quickly, but because she had the specific discomfort of someone who was genuinely ashamed, rather than merely managing optics. "Then I have one request," he said. "Before anything else." "Name it." "I want to address the staff." He said it without drama. "Not management. Staff. The people who work in this building. Tomorrow morning before my keynote, I want 15 minutes with the people who work the front desk, the housekeeping staff, the kitchen workers, the people who watched this happen or heard about it through the back channels that move faster than any official communication." Meredith Boone was quiet for a moment. "You want to address the staff? I've spent 30 years telling officers that leadership is not what you do when the cameras are on. It's what you do in the parking garages, in the break rooms, in the spaces nobody photographs." He held her gaze. "This building has people in it who will wonder, tomorrow morning, whether what happened to me was an anomaly or a pattern they should have reported and didn't. I'd rather they hear something useful than nothing." She agreed. What happened next unfolded across 2 timelines simultaneously. On one timeline, the formal one, the legal machinery engaged with the specific sound such machinery makes, the grinding of gears that were built to move slowly but which, when given sufficient input, can move with startling speed. Calvin had the hotel's corporate counsel on record before 8 o'clock that evening. By 10, the parent company had issued a statement to the Charlotte Observer expressing regret and confirming an ongoing internal investigation. By 11, T. Burnett and D. Burnett and D. Burnett, Sowell were informed that their employment was being terminated pending review, which, in the grammar of corporate HR, meant terminated. David Kessler, the general manager, was placed on administrative leave, while the investigation determined the degree to which his supervision had created conditions permissive of what had occurred. The parking garage footage was preserved. The security office footage was preserved. The crack in Reginald's phone screen was photographed and catalogued as evidence. On the other timeline, the one that moved through text messages and shared video clips and quiet conversations in the hotel's employee break room, something else was happening. 2 members of the front desk staff, both black women who had worked at the hotel for a combined 11 years, had been present in the lobby when Reginald made his calls. They had seen the marks on his wrists. One of them, a woman named Kezia, who was 24 and had been thinking about leaving the hospitality industry for 2 years, had started crying quietly in the back office at around 6 o'clock. And when her shift supervisor asked what was wrong, she said, "He was a colonel. He was wearing a badge from the event we're hosting. And they zip-tied him in the garage. And nobody stopped it." Her shift supervisor, a man named Paul who had 3 sons and had coached youth basketball for 12 years, didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "Did you see it happen?" And Kezia said, "No. I saw him when they brought him through. I saw his wrists." And Paul said, "Then you document what you saw." You write it down, you date it, and you put it somewhere safe. Because that man is going to need people who tell the truth. And you tell the truth. She did. At 9 o'clock that evening, Reginald Okafor sat in his hotel room. He had checked in. The suite had been upgraded without comment. He had declined the upgrade and taken the standard room he'd reserved, and video called his daughter in Okinawa. The time difference made it 10 in the morning where she was. She was in her PT uniform, coffee in hand, and she already knew. The news had reached the base through the particular military grapevine that moves at the speed of genuine outrage. "Dad," she said, "are you okay?" "I'm fine, Ahalia." She looked at him carefully through the screen, the way she had looked at him since she was small, with the specific skepticism of someone who knew he minimized. "Your wrists. Bruised. Nothing broken. And you're still doing the keynote tomorrow." "Of course." She was quiet for a moment. Behind her, he could see the corner of a mess hall table, the edge of a window with flat grey Pacific sky. She had her mother's eyes, his build, and a composure that had started to emerge around age 12 and had only deepened. She was a first lieutenant. She was 26. She was going to outlast most of the people she currently outranked. "Tell him something real tomorrow," she said. "Not the version where you make it academic." "I always make it academic." "I know. Don't this time." He looked at his daughter for a long moment across 12 time zones and everything that had happened that day. "All right," he said. "I'll try." He was not a man who cried easily. He did not cry then. But after the call ended, he sat for a while in the silence of the hotel room and let himself feel the full weight of what had happened. Not the legal dimensions of it, not the institutional implications, but the raw human fact of standing in a parking garage in a tailored suit with a name badge around his neck and having a stranger decide, in the span of 4 seconds, what kind of person he must be. He had been here before. Not in this garage, not with these men, but in this space. This specific space the black men in America learn to navigate before they're old enough to name it. He had navigated it at West Point and in Baghdad, and in the corridors of the Pentagon, and in rental car lines and hotel lobbies, and on streets where he had never been anything but law-abiding and purposeful. He had learned to carry it without letting it show, which was a skill and also, he had come to understand, a kind of damage. He thought about the people driving Route 9 in Georgia, who had paid their fines and gone home because they didn't have a tracking device in their car or a 4-star general's phone number in their contacts. He thought about every person in a parking garage or a hotel lobby or a traffic stop who had been zip-tied or handcuffed or just watched with suspicion, because someone had decided, in 4 seconds, what they must be. He thought about what he was going to say in the morning. Then he set his alarm for 5:30, put his phone on the nightstand and slept. He addressed the staff at 7:45 in the morning, in the hotel's main conference room before it was set for the symposium. About 30 people were there. Front desk, housekeeping, kitchen, maintenance. They stood in clusters or sat in chairs still stacked against the wall. Some of them had heard about what happened. Some of them had seen it. All of them looked at him with a particular alertness, the kind that happens when someone who has been hurt shows up the next morning and doesn't look broken. He didn't use a microphone. He stood in the middle of the room and spoke at a volume that required them to be quiet to hear him, which is one of the oldest teaching techniques there is. He told them what happened, simply and without embellishment. He told them that he was not standing there because he was a colonel, but that being a colonel was why anyone was held accountable. He told them that there were people this happened to who had no 4-star contacts, no attorney on speed dial, no keynote address that created institutional pressure. He told them that those people existed in this hotel, in this city, on the roads outside, and that the most powerful thing any individual in the system could do was refuse to look away when the system hurt someone. Document it. Name it. Tell the truth to someone who will preserve it. He looked at Kezia, who was standing near the back. She didn't know he knew her name. He didn't signal anything, but he said, "The people who tell the truth in the small moments are the ones who make the large moments possible." And he meant her specifically, and she knew it, and she stood up straighter. The keynote address at 9 o'clock was recorded. The room held approximately 200 people, military officers, veterans advocates, policy researchers, journalists, a city councilwoman, and the chief of the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department, who had been invited 3 weeks earlier for an entirely different reason, and who sat in the third row looking like a man doing very careful listening. Reginald Okafor stood at the podium and did what his daughter had asked him to do. He made it personal. He described standing in the garage. He described the zip tie. He described the specific sensation of being looked at and having someone decide, faster than thought, that he was a threat. He described it not as a colonel reporting an incident, but as a man telling a truth that had been true his entire life, and that he had spent considerable professional energy not saying in exactly these terms. The room was very quiet for approximately 90 seconds after he finished. Then the chief of police started clapping, alone, which prompted the room. Reginald stood at the podium and let it happen without acknowledging it much, because he had not told the truth in order to receive applause. He had told it because his daughter asked him to, and because 30 years of making things academic had not changed a single thing about parking garages. The formal outcomes were these. T. Burnett and D. Sowell were terminated. The investigation found that Sowell had 3 prior internal complaints filed against him in 6 years, all involving black guests, none of which had resulted in any disciplinary action. The failure to act on those complaints was included in the legal settlement, the terms of which were confidential, but which Calvin described to Reginald as significant without using a number. David Kessler resigned before the investigation concluded. He subsequently gave an interview to a local news outlet in which he described himself as a victim of a no-win situation, a characterization that landed poorly and was not revisited. The parent hospitality company implemented mandatory bias and de-escalation training across all 37 properties, a measure that their corporate communications team described as long-planned and merely accelerated by recent events, a statement that satisfied no one who had been paying attention. The Charlotte City Council passed a resolution calling for independent review of private security contractor standards within the city, with specific attention to use of restraint protocols. The resolution was non-binding, which meant it had exactly the force that non-binding resolutions have, which is to say, moral, public, and occasionally sufficient. In the end, what lasted longest was not the settlement or the terminations or the training modules or the resolution. What lasted was a photograph. It ran in the Charlotte Observer 2 days after the incident. Reginald had not posed for it and had not been aware it was being taken. It was shot by a staff photographer who had been covering the symposium and had arrived early enough to catch the tail end of the staff address. In the photograph, Reginald Okafor stands in a conference room full of hotel workers. He is not at a podium, he is not behind a table, he is standing in the middle of the room with no barrier between himself and the people listening. His jacket off, his shirt still crisp, his wrists visible at his sides, where 2 faint parallel marks are just discernible if you know to look. He is looking at someone in the back of the room. His expression is not triumphant. It is not angry. It is the expression of a man saying something true to people who need to hear it and who are, for once, in a room where they are allowed to hear it. The photograph was shared 200,000 times in the first 48 hours. The caption in the paper read simply, Colonel Reginald Okafor addresses hotel staff October 9th. Underneath it in the comments someone wrote, he didn't have to do that. That's the whole point. Someone else wrote, they tried to take his dignity. He went and gave some to other people instead. Reginald did not read the comments. He was already back at Fort Bragg by then, in his office at 7:15 in the morning, doing what he had done every morning for 30 years, working on what came next. His daughter texted him that evening. She had seen the photograph. The text read, "You made it personal." He texted back, "You told me to." She sent a single emoji, a small star. He put his phone down and looked out the window at the pines outside the installation. The same pines that had been there before him and would be there after him. Indifferent and patient and enduring. He thought about the man driving home from the Meridian Grand right now, in whatever city, who had been looked at wrong and said nothing and absorbed it the way you absorb things when you have no other option. He thought about the next parking garage, the next Thursday afternoon with the fluorescent lights out. He thought, we have work to do. Then he picked up his pen and got back to it. What happened to Colonel Reginald Okafor in that garage was not an accident. It was not a misunderstanding. It was the end result of a long chain of small decisions, unchallenged complaints, unreviewed policies, uninvestigated patterns that were allowed to continue because the people most harmed by them often had the least power to stop them. It took a colonel to make it stop. That is not a success story. That is a warning dressed in the clothes of one. The question worth sitting with is this: how many people walked through that same garage, in that same city, and never made it into the news? How many cleared their throats and paid their fines and drove home and said nothing because they couldn't afford not to? If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it, not because justice was done. It was, partially, imperfectly, the way it usually is, but because the people who write these stories into being are still out there in the break rooms and the back offices deciding whether to tell the truth. They deserve to know it matters. Subscribe to Voices of Truth, and don't miss what comes next. I keep coming back to the moment when Reginald Okafor sat in that security office, hands bound, phone gone, no witness in the room, and chose not to rage. Not because he wasn't angry. He was. You could feel it in the way he described it afterward. The cold kind. The kind that settles in your stomach and doesn't burn. It just stays there. But he made a decision in that chair, and that decision is the whole story, really. Everything else. The attorney, the general, the photograph. Those were consequences of a man who had trained himself for 30 years to think clearly when everything around him was designed to make him stop thinking. That's what I find myself sitting with. Not the outcome, but the discipline it took to get there. There's a version of that day that ends differently. A version where Reginald raises his voice, or moves his arms wrong, or says something that gives T. Burnett an excuse. And in that version, nobody calls a colonel's attorney. Nobody preserves the footage. Nobody asks Kezia to write down what she saw. The machine doesn't move. He just becomes another incident that didn't happen the right way to be taken seriously. He knew that. He knew it the same way black men in America learn to know things. Early. Without being formally taught. Through the accumulated weight of watching what happens to people who react the way their anger deserves. So he sat still. He counted. He narrated. He was precise. That precision wasn't weakness. It was the most powerful thing in the room, and everyone who saw it eventually understood that, including the man who cut the zip tie off his wrists. What gets me is that the same quality, that steadiness, that refusal to let the worst moment define the terms of what comes next is the thing that made him worth listening to the next morning in that conference room. Not the stars on his collar, not the lawsuit, the fact that he stood in front of 30 hotel workers and made it about them. That took something. A smaller version of that man. A man who had let the humiliation do what humiliation is designed to do, would have checked out of the hotel and let the lawyers handle it, and never looked at Kezia. He didn't do that. I think about that choice a lot. The choice to convert what happened to you into something useful for someone else. It's not natural. It doesn't come automatically. It's built slowly out of the decision to keep your integrity intact when every circumstance is working against it. Reginald had built that over decades. Not through grand gestures, but through the ordinary discipline of showing up and telling the truth, and holding himself to a standard that didn't move depending on who was watching. And the people who zip-tied him? What they had built over time was the opposite, a habit of looking away from their own patterns. A comfort with power that went unchecked. Sowell had 3 complaints filed against him in 6 years. 3 times, someone said something. 3 times, nothing happened. That's not a bad apple. That's a container that was never cleaned. The outcome wasn't punishment from outside. It was the inevitable weight of what they had been building all along, finally catching up. That's the part I keep returning to. Not that Reginald won, but that both things were true at once. He had spent 30 years building something that held, and they had spent years building something that collapsed. The parking garage just happened to be where those 2 trajectories finally met. His daughter told him to make it personal. He did. And it mattered more than anything he could have made academic.